The world at the dawn of the 5th century before Christ stood at a crossroads, as if the fates themselves had woven together two destinies bound to clash. On one side rose the mighty empire of Persia, stretched vast and shimmering across continents, its kings enthroned as lords of men, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Anatolia, from the valleys of Mesopotamia to the distant edges of India. Their rule seemed unshakable, their armies endless, their wealth inexhaustible. They were the heirs of Cyrus, Cambyses, and now Darius the Great, master of the known world, who ruled not merely as a man, but as a figure divinely sanctioned to bring order where he declared it. On the other side stood a small collection of city-states scattered along the rocky coasts and mountains of Greece. Their armies were tiny by comparison, their wealth fragile, their unity uncertain. But among them Athens was beginning to rise, a city that had dared to cast off tyrants, a city that had embraced a strange and daring experiment called democracy, where citizens themselves held power and debated their future. And in this fragile soil of liberty, Persia saw both threat and opportunity. The story begins years before the clash of Marathon with the Ionian Revolt. Along the coast of Asia Minor lived Greeks who had been subject to the Persian yoke. Their cities were wealthy and vibrant, but their independence had been chained. When they rose against Darius, seeking to reclaim the freedom their ancestors once knew, Athens and Eretria sent ships to aid them. It was a bold act of defiance, tiny states challenging the greatest monarch of the age. For a brief moment, the fires of rebellion burned bright, and the city of Sardis itself was set ablaze. But Persia was not an empire that tolerated rebellion. The revolt was crushed, its cities punished, its hopes scattered to the winds. Yet the memory of Athenian ships at Sardis lodged deep in Darius's mind, like a thorn that festered. He, king of kings, would not forgive, and he would not forget. Darius swore vengeance upon Athens and Eretria. The story tells that he even commanded a servant to whisper in his ear each day, 3 times over, "Master, remember the Athenians." His wrath became not merely political but personal. To him, Athens was not just a city but a challenge to the natural order. The Greeks had dared to resist, and worse, they had dared to interfere in Persia's dominion. They would pay dearly. In Athens, the mood was different. The young democracy had only recently been forged in the struggles against tyranny and the reforms of Cleisthenes. The people were discovering what it meant to govern themselves, to cast votes, to hold debates in the assembly, to decide not only their future, but also their survival. Every step forward was precarious, for Athens was still surrounded by rivals and enemies, Sparta foremost among them. But the Athenians also carried a fierce pride, a belief that they were no longer subjects of kings, but citizens of a polis, free and equal before the law. This spirit would soon be tested in ways they could scarcely imagine. The Persian king prepared his retribution. He sent heralds across the Greek world, demanding earth and water, the symbols of submission. Many cities, fearing the might of Persia, complied, but Athens and Sparta did not. They rejected the demand, and in some accounts the Athenians cast the Persian envoys into a pit, while the Spartans threw them into a well, mocking them to dig up earth and water there. The insult was sharp, and the die was cast. In 490 BC, Darius launched his great expedition. A Persian armada set sail, carrying soldiers, cavalry, and supplies, sweeping across the Aegean like a storm. Along the way, they punished Eretria for its defiance, besieging and capturing the city, burning its temples, enslaving its people. The message was clear. This was the fate that awaited any who stood against Persia. Athens was next. The Persians landed on the plains of Marathon, a flat expanse along the Attic coast, wide enough to host their cavalry and open battle formations. Their force may have numbered in the tens of thousands, though the exact figure is lost in the haze of history. The Athenians, outnumbered by staggering odds, faced annihilation. Yet they did not yield. Instead, they marched out from their city, calling upon allies and the gods, and stood face to face with the invaders. Among them was a general named Miltiades, who had once served Persia and knew their ways. He urged the Athenians to strike boldly, to use their strength as hoplites, heavily armed citizen soldiers fighting in close ranks with spear and shield. With him stood the polemarch Callimachus, chosen by lot, whose vote in council tipped the balance toward battle. And at their side, the messenger Pheidippides had run to Sparta seeking aid. A legendary distance covered in 2 days, begging the Lacedaemonians to send troops. The Spartans, bound by religious festival, delayed. The Athenians would stand alone, save for a small band from Plataea, their loyal allies, who marched to their side in solidarity. It was 10,000 against perhaps 25,000 or more, a fraction against a horde. The Persians expected an easy victory. The Athenians knew only that they must fight, for if Athens fell, their homes, their families, their democracy would vanish in fire and chains. And so the stage was set upon the windswept plain of Marathon for a battle that would echo across the centuries. The Persian camp at Marathon was a sight unlike anything most Greeks had ever imagined. Row upon row of tents stretched across the plain, banners fluttering in the sea breeze, soldiers from every corner of the empire speaking in tongues foreign to Athenian ears. There were Persians in their brightly patterned trousers, Medes with their rounded wicker shields, archers from the east with bows strung from horn and sinew, and cavalrymen whose horses stamped impatiently, eager for open ground. Behind them waited the dark hulls of hundreds of ships, their sails furled, their decks heavy with supplies. This was not a raiding party, it was an army sent to punish, to destroy, to remind the world of Persia's might. To the Athenians who approached, the sight was terrifying. They were citizen soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, men who had left behind plows and tools to don bronze armor. Their phalanx was disciplined, but it was not endless. 10,000 stood where the Persians seemed without number. Yet they did not retreat. They camped near the foothills, where the mountains met the plain, placing themselves in a position where the enemy's cavalry would struggle to maneuver. Day after day, the two forces glared at one another across the expanse of Marathon. The Athenians waited, hoping for Spartan reinforcements. The Persians waited too, confident that time was on their side. The Persian commanders, Datis and Artaphernes, were no strangers to war. They had burned Eretria with ease. They expected Athens to crumble just as quickly. But here, before them, the Athenians did not surrender. The Persians knew the Greek spirit, the arrogance of free men who fought not as subjects but as equals, and they prepared to crush it. They placed their faith in their archers and cavalry, in the weight of numbers and the inevitability of fear. Inside the Athenian camp, debates raged. Some argued that they should remain within the city walls, defending their homes and families. Others feared that if they hesitated, the Persians might march inland, devastating the countryside. Still others clung to hope that Sparta would arrive in time, that their powerful allies would bring salvation. But Miltiades, the general who had once served under Persian kings, spoke with urgency. He knew the danger of delay. He warned that the longer they waited, the greater the risk that the Persians would sail directly to Athens, leaving the army stranded far from the city. He argued that they must fight here on this plain while the Persians were contained before their ships could circle around the coast. The Council of Generals was divided. The fate of Athens seemed to hang on a single vote. It came to the polemarch, Callimachus, whose decision would tip the balance. The sources say that Miltiades pleaded with him, reminding him that his choice would determine whether Athens lived free or perished in chains. At last, Callimachus cast his vote for battle. The decision was made. Athens would not wait for Sparta. Athens would fight. As the days passed, omens were read, sacrifices made to the gods. The Athenians prayed to Artemis, to Athena, to Zeus himself, asking for favor in the coming clash. In Plataea, their allies marched out, leaving their own city vulnerable, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Athenians. It was a gesture that would never be forgotten, for it showed that not all of Greece would bend before Persia. Meanwhile, Pheidippides, the famed runner, had returned from Sparta. His message was bitter. The Spartans had promised aid, but not until the sacred festival of the Carnea was over. Religious law bound them. They could not march until the moon was full. For Athens, there would be no Spartan spears in time. They would stand alone. Still, the Athenians held firm. Day after day, they watched the Persians. Skirmishes were rare, for both armies waited, each trying to draw the other into a mistake. The Persians believed the Athenians would eventually break, demoralized by fear and isolation. The Athenians knew that the Persians could not remain forever, that they too must act before supplies or strategy shifted against them. Tension built, like a bowstring drawn tight, until the moment came when hesitation could no longer be endured. The Persians, growing restless, devised a plan. Part of their force would re-embark upon the ships, sailing around Cape Sunion to strike Athens directly. If successful, they would leave the Athenian army stranded at Marathon, while the city fell undefended. This was the moment Miltiades had warned of. He saw that the Persian force left behind was vulnerable, its cavalry absent, its strength divided. It was now or never. He urged immediate attack. At dawn, as the sun rose over the mountains and lit the plain in gold, the Athenians prepared themselves. They tightened the straps of their bronze cuirasses, set helmets upon their brows, and took up their long spears and round shields. The hoplites formed their phalanx, a wall of men and bronze, each trusting the shield of his neighbor, each bound together in common cause. They were farmers, potters, herdsmen, merchants, but on this day they were warriors, citizens of a city that refused to kneel. Across the plain, the Persians prepared as well, confident in their strength. They lined their archers and infantry, their wicker shields glittering, their spears and bows ready. They expected the Greeks to hesitate, to tremble, perhaps to beg for mercy. They did not expect what was about to come. Suddenly, with a cry that carried across the field, the Athenians charged. No cautious advance, no measured step. They ran, shields up, spears forward, closing the gap at a speed the Persians did not anticipate. Herodotus tells us it was the first time Greeks had ever charged at a run into battle, a reckless, desperate act meant to shorten the deadly barrage of arrows that awaited them. Across nearly a mile of open ground, the Athenians thundered forward, the ground shaking beneath their feet, their war cries echoing through the plain. For a moment, the Persians could hardly believe what they saw. 10,000 men hurling themselves at the greatest empire in the world, not with fear, but with fury. The sky darkened as Persian arrows flew, but the Greeks pressed on, their shields deflecting, their formation unbroken. And then the lines met, bronze crashing against wicker, spear against flesh, shield against shield. The Battle of Marathon had begun. The collision of the two armies shook the earth. For an instant, the Persians believed sheer weight of numbers would break the Athenian line, as it had countless times before against lesser foes. Their archers had loosed volley after volley, blackening the sky, and now their infantry pressed forward, swords and spears striking in wild arcs. But they had underestimated the resolve and discipline of the hoplite phalanx. Each Greek stood locked in formation, shield pressed against shield, spears thrusting over the rim of bronze, the line moving as one body. They fought not as scattered individuals, but as a wall of men, each bound to his neighbor. The Persians, accustomed to lighter armor and looser formations, found themselves repelled. Their wicker shields splintered beneath the force of bronze-tipped spears, their short swords too frail to match the reach and thrust of Greek weaponry. The shock of the charge had broken their rhythm, and for the first time, the tide did not immediately turn in their favor, yet the Persians were not so easily undone. Their center pressed hard, where the Greek phalanx was thinnest. Miltiades had arranged his men with a daring stratagem. He weakened the middle deliberately, bolstering the wings instead. The Persians surged into this center, driving the Athenians back step by step, their confidence surging as they sensed weakness. The Athenian line bent, almost to the point of breaking, and for a moment it seemed that the gamble had failed. But it was a feint, a trap hidden in plain sight. On the flanks, the Greek wings, reinforced and bristling with strength, began to push. The Plataeans on one side, the Athenians on the other, surged forward with unrelenting force. Their spears punched through Persian ranks, their shields drove the enemy back, and slowly, steadily, the wings began to curl inward. The Persians, pressing deep into the weakened center, now found themselves caught on both sides. It was as if the jaws of a great beast had closed upon them. The Greek wings enveloped the Persian flanks, and suddenly the hunters had become the hunted. Panic rippled through the Persian ranks as they realized they were being surrounded. Men shouted in dozens of languages, orders clashed, the unity of the great empire dissolved into chaos. Soldiers who had marched across continents now found themselves trapped on a narrow plain, hemmed in by the sea behind them and the hoplites before them. The slaughter was merciless. The Athenians drove their spears with precision, cutting down foes who had no space to maneuver. The Persians stumbled over one another in their desperation, trampled by their own, their wicker shields offering little protection against the relentless thrust of bronze. Those who turned to flee found the sea at their backs, their ships the only hope of escape. Men rushed into the surf, scrambling to climb aboard vessels, pushing each other aside, drowning in the chaos. The Greeks pursued them into the waves, striking at men chest-deep in water, seizing ships with their bare hands, dragging them back toward shore. In the midst of the struggle, heroes emerged. Callimachus, the polemarch whose vote had committed Athens to battle, fought at the front, leading his men with unshakable courage. He was struck down amid the melee, his body pierced by Persian weapons, but his sacrifice burned itself into the memory of his city. Another, the warrior Cynaegirus, grasped at a Persian ship as it attempted to flee. With bare hands he clutched the stern, trying to drag it back until his hand was severed by an axe. Even as he fell, his defiance embodied the spirit of Marathon. Better to die grasping the enemy than to let him slip away. The battle raged for hours, the plain soaked with blood, the air filled with cries of fury and terror. At last, the Persian line collapsed. They broke into a rout, abandoning their comrades, scrambling to escape the tightening noose of the phalanx. Only the sea and their ships spared them from total destruction. Of the vast Persian force, thousands lay dead upon the plain, their bodies scattered across the trampled earth. The Athenians, though victorious, had paid a price as well. 200 men fallen, their names etched forever in stone, but a fraction compared to the loss they had inflicted. When the dust settled, the Persians managed to salvage part of their force, retreating to their ships and sailing away. But the Athenians did not allow themselves to revel in victory. They understood that the danger was not over. The Persian fleet turned south, its sails catching the wind, aiming not for home but for Athens itself. Their plan was not yet abandoned. They would strike the city while its army was still away at Marathon, vulnerable, undefended. Miltiades grasped the peril at once. He ordered the army to march immediately, without rest. Bloodied and weary though they were, the hoplites obeyed, pushing their bodies to the brink as they hurried back across the rugged terrain toward their city. The march from Marathon to Athens was as crucial as the battle itself, for if they arrived too late, their homes and families would be lost. When at last they reached the walls, their armor still stained with battle, they stood ready once more. And so, when the Persian fleet arrived off the coast of Athens, they found no open gates, no undefended city, but the same hoplites who had shattered them at Marathon, now standing resolute shields, raised, daring them to come ashore. The Persians hesitated, then turned away. Their great expedition had failed. On the plain of Marathon, in that hour of defiance, the Greeks had accomplished what the world thought impossible. A tiny democracy, scarcely more than a city-state, had stood against the might of the Persian Empire and prevailed. The cost in blood was heavy, but the reward was survival, freedom, and a legend that would echo across ages. The Athenians buried their dead in a great mound upon the battlefield, raising a memorial that endures to this day. They inscribed upon stone the names of those who had fallen, not as individuals of wealth or rank, but as citizens equal in sacrifice. For in their unity, in their willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder, they had secured not only their city, but also a vision of freedom that would shape the destiny of Greece. In the years after the plain of Marathon had drunk its fill of blood, Athens stood transformed. The victory became a heartbeat in the soul of the city, a memory that echoed in every debate, every temple, every new venture. Citizens walked through the agora with heads held high, for they were no longer merely Athenians. They were the men who had defied the Persian Empire. They carried within them the pride of those who had faced annihilation and found instead immortality. Marathon was spoken of not only as a battle, but as a revelation. It proved that a free people, bound not by fear of a king but by shared resolve, could stand against tyranny and prevail. In the assembly, orators reminded their fellow citizens that when the Persians came, it was not a monarch who commanded them, but their own collective decision. When Callimachus cast the decisive vote, it was the voice of the people that chose to fight, and it was the courage of the people that carried the day. Democracy itself had been tested in the crucible of war and emerged stronger, but pride carried danger, for hubris is never far from the Greek heart. Victorious Athens soon began to assert itself with greater boldness among its neighbors. The Plataeans, loyal allies at Marathon, were honored and bound in friendship. Yet tensions grew with other states who looked upon Athenian pride with unease. Most of all, Sparta, who had been absent from the battle, watched Athens carefully. The Spartans, bound by their religious festival at the time, had arrived days too late, only to find the Persians already driven into the sea. They congratulated the Athenians, but a seed of rivalry had been planted. For if Athens could defeat Persia without Sparta, what did that mean for the balance of power in Greece? Meanwhile, across the sea, the memory of Marathon burned with fury in the Persian court. Darius, humiliated, had already begun to plan another invasion, one greater and more overwhelming. But the empire was vast, and rebellions stirred in Egypt and elsewhere. Before he could march again upon Greece, Darius fell, and his throne passed to his son, Xerxes. The young king inherited not only the empire but also his father's vow of vengeance. Xerxes was determined that the insult of Marathon would be avenged, not with a raid, but with a conquest so absolute that Greece would never again dare resist. In Athens, the shadow of this inevitable storm weighed heavily. The people knew that Marathon had been only the beginning. The Persians would come again, and when they did, they would not come in mere tens of thousands, but in hundreds of thousands. If Athens was to survive, it would need more than courage. It would need preparation, vision, and above all, unity. It was in this climate that a new leader rose, one whose foresight would shape the destiny of Athens: Themistocles. Unlike many of his peers, Themistocles saw clearly that Athens could not rely forever on the hoplite phalanx alone. The Persians had ships, fleets that could strike swiftly across the sea, carrying armies to every coast. If Athens was to stand against the empire, it must command the waters. He urged the Athenians to build a navy, to use the wealth of newly discovered silver mines at Laurium, not for personal enrichment, but for the construction of triremes, swift, deadly warships that could change the course of history. At first, many resisted. They clung to the memory of Marathon, believing that hoplites and spears alone had secured victory. But Themistocles reminded them of the narrow escape, of the Persian fleet that had nearly taken Athens while the army marched back from Marathon. Next time, he warned, they would not arrive in time. The city would burn. Slowly, reluctantly, the Athenians agreed. The fleet was built, row by row, oar by oar, until the harbors of Athens teemed with ships of war. And as Athens grew stronger, so too did its confidence in leadership. The city began to imagine itself not only as a defender of Greece, but as a leader among Greeks. The memory of Marathon was invoked again and again as proof of their worthiness. When other states hesitated, Athens pointed to the mound of the fallen and said, "We stood when no one else would, and we prevailed." Across the Greek world, Marathon became a symbol. To some, it was an inspiration, proof that Persia was not invincible. To others, it was a challenge, for it set a standard of courage that few could match. When Xerxes began to gather his immense host, stories of Marathon spread through every city and village. The Persians were coming, the greatest army the world had ever seen, but the memory of Marathon gave hope that they could be resisted. The Persians, too, remembered. Marathon had taught them that the Greeks were not to be dismissed as mere rabble. They had fought with discipline, with cunning, with ferocity that rivaled the best of Persia's troops. Xerxes would not repeat his father's mistake. He would bring overwhelming force, not just soldiers but bridges, ships, engineers and supplies enough to crush Greece utterly. Where Darius had sent an expedition, Xerxes would lead an empire. Thus, Marathon became a seed of two legacies. For Athens, a source of pride, unity and ambition. For Persia, a wound that demanded revenge. The plain where 10,000 Athenians had stood against countless foes would not be forgotten, but it was also only the first chapter of a greater struggle. Ahead lay Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, the great crescendo of the Persian wars. But Marathon would always remain the beginning, the spark that lit the fire of resistance. For the Athenians, each generation after would look back to that day. Fathers told sons how their grandfathers had charged across the plain, how they had driven the Persians into the sea. Poets wove the tale into verse, sculptors carved it into stone, historians recorded it as the moment when history itself had shifted. Marathon became not only a memory, but a measure, a standard by which all future deeds would be judged. To fight for Athens was to inherit the spirit of Marathon. And as the years rolled forward, the Athenians built not only walls and ships, but also an identity. They were the people of the polis that had defied Persia. They were the guardians of freedom, the champions of democracy. Whether this was wholly true or whether it was a story they told themselves mattered little. What mattered was that they believed it. Marathon had given them not only victory, but purpose. Time, like the tide, rolls onward, yet some moments never recede. Marathon became one such moment, etched not only into stone and song, but into the very fabric of history. For the Athenians, the memory of the battle was never simply about spears and shields clashing on a sunlit plain. It was about the revelation that free men, choosing their own fate, could stand against the greatest power the world had ever known and carve victory out of the jaws of doom. The mound that rose over the dead at Marathon stood for centuries, a silent witness to sacrifice. Travelers came from distant lands to gaze upon it, to wonder how so few could have defied so many. Each name inscribed was more than a life lost. It was a testament to the courage that had altered the destiny of nations. In the annual rites, Athenians poured libations to the fallen, calling them not simply men, but heroes, almost gods, who had purchased the freedom of Greece with their blood. In the years after Marathon, the story grew. Like all legends, it acquired layers beyond the bare facts of battle. The tale of Pheidippides, the runner who raced to Athens with the news of victory and fell dead upon delivering it, captured imaginations. Though details blurred with time, the essence of the tale endured. That victory had been so hard won that even the messenger gave his life. From this myth was born a symbol of endurance that still echoes millennia later in the races that bear his name. The marathon became not only a place, but an idea, the triumph of human will against the impossible. The Athenians themselves carried the spirit of that day into every challenge that followed. When Xerxes returned with his titanic host, it was the memory of Marathon that stiffened their resolve. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and their allies stood in the same spirit, knowing they would fall, but determined to hold the pass. At Salamis, as triremes clashed amid the waves, Athenians remembered that they had once charged across a plain and driven the Persians into the sea. And at Plataea, when Greeks finally shattered the Persian army for good, it was Marathon that lived in their hearts as proof that victory was possible. Yet Marathon's legacy was not confined to Greece. The Persians too remembered it. For them, it was a scar upon their pride, a small people who had dared to humiliate the great king. Xerxes' invasion was driven as much by the need to erase that shame as by the desire to conquer. Though Persia remained mighty long after the wars were over, the sting of Marathon never quite faded, a reminder that even empires are not invincible. In the centuries that followed, the story of Marathon passed beyond the Greeks themselves. Historians such as Herodotus preserved its memory, weaving it into the great tapestry of the Persian wars. Philosophers and statesmen invoked it as proof of the power of courage, of freedom, of unity against tyranny. Even in distant lands, Marathon became a byword for valor. To stand like the Athenians at Marathon was to stand for liberty itself. As Athens rose to become a cultural beacon, Marathon became part of its identity. The Parthenon, the plays of Aeschylus, the dialogues of philosophers, all these flowered in a city that believed itself chosen by history, steeled by Marathon. The battle gave Athenians the conviction that they had a role greater than themselves, a mission to lead, to teach, to inspire. Without Marathon, perhaps Athens would have remained a modest polis, overshadowed by Sparta or Thebes. With it, Athens soared, and with it soared the ideas of democracy, philosophy, and art that would shape the world to come. Marathon also lived on as a lesson in strategy. The double envelopment, the bold charge across open ground, the ability to exploit the enemy's weaknesses, these became case studies for generals throughout history. Centuries later, when Alexander of Macedon led his armies east against Persia, he marched in the footsteps of Marathon, carrying forward the legacy of Greek defiance. Even in modern times, military leaders and thinkers look back to Marathon as an example of how audacity and discipline can overcome overwhelming odds. But beyond strategy and politics, Marathon endured because it spoke to something timeless in the human spirit. It was the story of the few who stood against the many, of the free who defied the tyrant, of courage that triumphed over fear. Every age has found in Marathon a mirror of its own struggles, a source of inspiration in the face of daunting challenges. From revolutionaries fighting empires to ordinary men and women confronting impossible odds, Marathon has lived on as a symbol that the impossible is not beyond reach. And so the plain of Marathon remains more than earth and grass. It is a memory that echoes across millennia, a whisper from the past that tells us what humanity is capable of when it chooses resolve over despair. The Athenians of that day could not have known that their charge would echo through history. They could not have imagined that long after their names were forgotten, their deeds would still inspire. Yet such is the nature of true courage. It lives beyond the moment, beyond the battlefield, beyond the grave. As the sun sets over the Aegean today, casting its golden light over the ancient land, one can still imagine the clash of shields, the roar of warriors, the thunder of feet upon the plain. The battle is long past, but its spirit endures. Marathon was not the end but the beginning, not just a victory but a legacy. It was the day when 10,000 Greeks defied an empire, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. When the last Spartan fell upon the hill of Thermopylae and the dust of battle finally settled, silence descended upon the pass. The Persians had won the ground, but they had not broken the spirit that had animated the defenders. The narrow strip of earth was now a graveyard, littered with broken shields, shattered spears, and bodies piled so high that the stench of death would linger for weeks. Yet even amidst the ruin, the story of what had been done there began to take shape. Whispered first among the survivors, and then carried across the seas to every corner of Greece. The Greek allies who had departed when Leonidas dismissed them spread the tale of what they had witnessed. They told of the king who chose death over retreat, of the Spartans and Thespians who had fought until no weapon remained, and of the Persians who, despite their overwhelming numbers, had been delayed for days by a force no larger than a village. To some it seemed like myth, too great to be true, but the truth was greater still. For it was not only courage that defined the last stand at Thermopylae, it was the unyielding belief that freedom was worth dying for, that a man's life was nothing compared to the legacy of honor. In Sparta, the death of Leonidas was met not with wailing, but with pride. The mothers of the fallen spoke the words for which Sparta was famed: "He was my son, and he did his duty." The grief was real, but it was hidden beneath the iron mask of discipline. To Spartans, death in battle was the highest honor, and the sacrifice at Thermopylae was not a tragedy but a triumph. They believed their king had fulfilled the prophecy of the oracle, and in his death he had secured the glory of Sparta for generations. For the Persians, the victory at Thermopylae was both a triumph and a humiliation. Xerxes had forced the pass open, but the cost was greater than he had ever expected. His elite troops, the Immortals, had been bloodied by a fraction of their number. His vast army had seen that courage could overcome fear, that skill could hold back sheer weight of numbers. The King of Kings pressed on toward Athens, but shadows now followed him, the whisper that even his might could be resisted. And so the story of Thermopylae spread like wildfire. Across Greece, cities that had wavered now found new courage. Athens, though it would soon be burned, prepared for its naval stand at Salamis. Sparta prepared to march once more. The resolve of a united Greece, fragile before Thermopylae, now grew stronger, bound together by the memory of what had been achieved at the Hot Gates. Years later, when the Persians were driven from Greece, when Plataea and Mycale had broken their power forever, the memory of Thermopylae still burned bright. A monument was raised on the battlefield, a stone lion to honor Leonidas, and an epitaph that would live for eternity was carved into the earth. "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws." Simple words, yet they carried the weight of immortality. They were not written for the dead, for the fallen no longer needed comfort. They were written for the living, to remind them of what it meant to stand unbroken in the face of annihilation. The legend of the 300 grew with the centuries. To the Greeks, it became a symbol of freedom against tyranny, of courage against impossible odds. To the Romans who later conquered Greece, it became a lesson in discipline and valor, studied by generals and soldiers alike. To poets and historians, it became a story to be told and retold, embroidered with myth, yet rooted in truth. And to the world beyond, it became one of the great eternal tales, a beacon shining from the ancient past into every age that followed. Even today, the Hot Gates remain a sacred place. The land has changed, the shoreline pushed back by time, the battlefield covered by centuries of earth. Yet the memory remains unshaken. Travelers still stand where Leonidas and his men once stood, gazing at the mountains and the sea, and they can almost hear the clash of bronze, the cries of defiance, the last roar of men who chose glory over life. And so, the Battle of Thermopylae did not end with death but with immortality. The Persians took the ground, but the Spartans and their allies claimed eternity. Their story reminds us that courage is not measured by numbers, but by spirit. That even the smallest band of men, if unyielding in their conviction, can shape the destiny of nations. The 300 did not live to see their victory, but in their sacrifice they planted the seed of freedom that would bloom not only in Greece, but across the ages. The hot gates became more than a place. They became a symbol, a reminder that when all seems lost, when the tide of darkness seems overwhelming, the courage of a few can light a flame that burns for all eternity. And so the tale of Thermopylae ends not with defeat, but with triumph. For the Spartans, the Thespians, and all who stood there are remembered still, not as men who died, but as men who became immortal. Though the stones of Thermopylae have long since crumbled, and the battlefield lies quiet beneath centuries of dust, the voices of the fallen still whisper across the ages. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the defiance of it. They remind us that freedom is never given, but bought with sacrifice. And they remind us that even in the face of impossible odds, the human spirit can burn so brightly that its flame never dies. The Spartans, the Thespians, and all who stood at the hot gates chose death over submission, honor over survival, immortality over silence. Their story is not one of defeat, but of triumph. A triumph that has echoed for more than 2,000 years, inspiring all who believe that a single stand can change the course of history. And so, when we speak of Thermopylae, we do not speak of loss. We speak of immortals,